Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our 504 webinar on supporting students with ADD, ADHD. Um, we're glad you could join us. And my name is Holly Bell. I am the Equity Specialist for the Utah State Board of Education, and I am the Section 504 Specialist. So we have a series going here. And I'll give you dates of upcoming webinars at the end, but we also have a webinar on anxiety. We have a foundation for Section 504 webinar, and we have a supporting students with concussions in school. And those are all on YouTube, so you can visit those at any time. We want to make sure that you have information on those disabilities that are most common, and because we have new coordinators that come in all the time, so that you have somewhere to go for the foundations of 504. So just a couple of housekeeping items. If you are participating and you want to ask questions, which we encourage you to do, you can just type those into the chat feed on YouTube, and there is a slight delay, but we will get to your questions. Feel free to ask them as we go along, and we'll leave time at the end for questions. Also, if you want to receive relicensure credit, make sure that you put your name into the chat feed, and we will be copying those and making sure that we're assigning credit. And so I think that's it. And now I actually have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Huey from the Salt Lake Behavioral Health. So I'm glad she could join me. She's the expert, and I will talk more to 504, but I'll let her introduce herself because she's the expert on students with ADHD. So, and you can ask, we can go back and forth as we go along, and so this can be interactive. So please.
Cool. So I'm Dr. Huey, like she said. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist that I'm running the adolescent inpatient unit at Salt Lake Behavioral Health. And ADHD is a special interest topic of mine. I've worked a lot outpatient with kids with ADHD in my previous job, working or finishing up my fellowship and residency. And so it's something that is very important. I take a lot of interest in.
I'm glad you can be here. So I'll be advancing your slides. Shall we move forward?
Yeah.
All right, let's go.
So our objectives, we're going to talk about the different kinds of presentations and the different needs that children and adolescents with ADHD have. Kind of talk about the typical presentation and then the ones that may be more subtle and are easier to miss. Also want to be able to identify disorders and things that tend to show up with ADHD by the end of this. Recognize the risks of not addressing or providing suboptimal care for these kids. And then by the end of this, should also be able to recognize some options to support students with ADHD and the need for Section 504 protections and accommodations. And I have no disclosures. Yeah. So ADHD is diagnosed in about 11% of children. And it's more common in males than females. Females are typically the ones that are easier to miss, especially in school. And most kids are diagnosed when they're about 6 years old or younger. And I think the important thing to keep in mind is that a third of children that are diagnosed with ADHD at 6 will still have it when they're an adult. So this is going to go with them from the time they're in kindergarten until they've graduated high school. So it's something that we need to be thinking about for all of our students. It's a highly heritable disorder. So if a kid has ADHD, it's likely that their parents have ADHD, which sometimes makes them a little bit frustrating to work with.
The parents, right? That
Yes.
never happens.
No. But it's something to keep in mind. Other things that are risk factors for ADHD are prenatal exposure. So if mom was smoking or drinking alcohol or using drugs during pregnancy, that's a risk factor. If the kid was low birth weight, so this includes preterm babies, they're at high risk. And kids with a history of head injuries, are also at high risk for ADHD. Whether that's because of the head injury or they have a head injury because they have ADHD, it's hard to tell.
I didn't know any of this. This was very informative to me, this slide. I had no idea.
So Tigger, I think, is a good representation of
yeah.
our usual kids with ADHD. These are the ones in kindergarten that can't sit still. They can't stay in their seat. Their hands are all over everything. You give them something to do, and 5 minutes later, they're off, like, reading a book in the corner, and you're just like, why? What are you doing? Or they pulled out the blocks or something. They're not finishing their assignments.
Yeah.
They don't stay focused. So, if you're trying to give them instructions or something, it seems like they're wandering off and they're just not paying attention to what you're telling them. And these are also kids that you can't give them 3 things to do and they go do them. Like you got to give them one thing at a time, or maybe, hey, let's work on, the front of this sheet, and then you got to remind them that, hey, there's a back too. So they're really going to struggle and be kind of, those are the ones that really stick out, I think.
Well, 3 seems so small, so it's hard to relate to that being too big of a number to keep track of for a person.
Yeah. The more subtle kids. Sleep's a common problem with ADHD too. A lot of parents, that's one of the big things they complain about when they come in my office is I can't get my kid to go to sleep. But the more subtle ones, the ones I think that get missed easily, and these are kids that they might not get diagnosed till late elementary or even middle school. Usually it's because they've figured out how to kind of
Manage.
Yeah, trying to manage their own disorder.
Uh-huh.
Yep. So they get overly organized. So they might pack their backpack the night before and get really anxious about it. And their desk is really neat, and they get like really annoyed if somebody moves something. But then they'll put it in a random place, and they're usually the one that put it in the wrong place. They forgot about it.
I've definitely seen the opposite, where their lockers are just a disaster, and their backpacks are just all over.
Yeah,
a
and
mess.
those are the more common ones. The kids with the folders, where like nothing is staying in there.
Or there isn't a folder.
Or there isn't one, yeah. Or they left it at school. The other thing that comes up is poor reading comprehension. If you can't pay attention, like these kids may finish reading a passage really quickly, but they didn't actually read it or process it. And so these are kids that they'll read something, but their mind's wandering and off somewhere else. And so they don't recall what they read. I think girls, they don't really fidget as much. They tend to talk too much. And so they're like passing notes.
I can see why it's hard for that to be distinguished, for, that girls are not found because they're so social and passing notes anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so if it's one that you're reminding a lot.
Yeah. Oh, okay. That's a good thing to watch out for.
Yep. Also, if they're talking, if you sit down to have a conversation with them and they're kind of going off on long tangents, this will happen in my office. I'll ask a kid one question, and like 5 minutes later, we're talking about something completely different. Haven't answered the question. That's pretty common too. Hyperfocus is, I think, a term that a lot of people with ADHD use. It's not a clinical term at all.
Oh.
But a lot of people with ADHD have noticed that they have this dysregulation of attention. It's not that they can't pay attention to anything. It's that they can't regulate their attention. They can't determine, when they're supposed to pay attention to something and when they're not.
So selective attention.
That implies they have conscious control over it. And that's the
True.
problem.
Yeah, so they don't. They can be selective. Yeah.
So they may get really, really focused on one thing and have a really hard time transitioning. Especially if it's something that they like. They want to sit there and just work on it. And then some things that people or kids might do in order to be hyperactive that are less noticeable might be like fidgeting, doodling, drawing during class.
I see you say difficulties socially. So what kind of difficulties do you see socially? It seems like...
So usually these are kids that just act younger than everybody else in their class.
Okay.
So, and maybe other kids don't really want to play with them or socialize with them as much, maybe because if they're, you know, really rowdy and hyperactive, they're a little bit too rowdy for some of the kids their same age.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Or maybe they, you know, with girls, I think more common is like they don't, it's, if you have trouble listening and paying attention to people talking, it's hard to build those social interactions with girls.
Mm-hmm.
And so they tend to kind of get excluded and stuff. Other kids don't want to interact with them because they feel like they don't listen, or maybe they talk too much, or they're annoying.
Interesting. Those are some interesting things. I mean, good things to watch out for that I never would have thought about.
And these are just some. I like looking for memes online to describe different things. So like anxiety memes, ADHD memes. And so this is how some people with ADHD feel like their brains work. You know, they're either utterly obsessed with something or they're not interested at all. Mm-hmm. And then reading with ADHD. This is why reading comprehension is so poor. Yeah. I'm going to read this whole book, and then you flick through the entire thing and reread the first chapter. And yeah. I think these are some important things to like kind of keep an eye out if you have a kid that has ADHD in your class. Make sure that you're watching out for other things that might be going on. Depression is really common. Anxiety is really common. Oppositional defiant disorder is really common. And usually it's because of the ADHD.
Interesting.
Not necessarily that they don't want to follow the rules. It's that they can't remember what the rules are.
And then they get frustrated that you're trying to get them to follow the rules and
that they're getting in trouble.
And
Yep. Sensory processing disorders are really common. So, difficulties with being like hypersensitive to certain things or not very sensitive at all to certain things in the environment. Learning disorders are common. So reading, you know, I think it's arithmetic disorder. I don't know. Math disorder or something. I don't know. I don't have them all memorized. Dyslexia.
We need a special ed person in here.
Yes. Yes. And then substance use, too, for older kids. You start seeing it in sometimes late elementary, but usually like middle, high school.
Oh, interesting. Do you think they're just trying to regulate, or why would they turn to substances? Do you know?
Some of it's because of the impulsivity that's part of it. You know, they don't make the best decisions because they're kind of impulsive. They don't think things through. And some of it's also like treating themselves, trying to make themselves feel normal. So.
I was surprised that autism wasn't a comorbidity, because a lot of the things you're describing sound like a student
like
who
autism?
is on the
And it's not listed, I think, officially in the DSM-5 or whatever, but you do see a lot of, not necessarily, if you take a bunch of kids with ADHD, I don't know that the prevalence of autism is much higher in that group. Mm-hmm. But when you're looking at kids with autism, the prevalence of ADHD is high.
Oh, okay.
So, and this is just that in picture form.
Oh, wow. Look at oppositional defiant disorder.
Yes.
And what's the difference between, for all of our participants, ODD and conduct disorder still?
So oppositional defiant is basically kids that just, I think my favorite phrase to describe it is, I'm not going to do what you tell me to. These are kids that are just, an authority figure tells them, hey, I need you to do this. And they're just like, no, not going to do it. I'm going to do the opposite. Mm-hmm. They're kids that just have a lot of behavioral problems, and it's hard to get them to kind of follow the rules and do what they're supposed to do. Conduct disorder is a little different, because kids with conduct, they tend to have more kind of bigger behavioral issues. So these are kids that might hurt other children intentionally, or might be stealing things. Usually not like, oh, they stole an eraser from some other kid in class. We're talking about like stealing money, stealing phones, expensive stuff. Kids with conduct disorder usually have more severe behavioral issues than just oppositional defiant.
Well, and when I talk about 504 and I talk about child find and I talk about discipline, these are really important things to highlight because I really try to encourage people to pay attention to discipline, to their behaviors, because there's often something underlying that.
Yep.
So ADHD underlying these, and even just oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder can be a reason to provide a student with 504 because it's substantially impacting their education. So these are good things to keep an eye out for.
This is just an aside about self-esteem, because we talk about ADHD and depression being, highly correlated, and really I think what we see is more how ADHD impacts self-esteem negatively.
Mm-hmm.
And these are pretty good, I think, quotes to kind of get the feel for that. It's hard to say what you mean when your brain makes connections internally at a rapid pace.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to express yourself if ADHD is in the way. And then because I had no idea why I couldn't behave the way everyone wanted to, I internalized the message that I was bad.
Mm-hmm. And therefore not socially accepted, and therefore depression, and it's a snowball effect.
Exactly. Yep.
Very good.
So, school-age children, young school-age, elementary, when we talk about the kind of psychological, emotional goals that they're supposed to have, we talk about Erickson stages, and this one's industry versus inferiority. So being productive versus being inferior to everyone else. Mm-hmm. And this is where kids develop a sense of competence. Mm-hmm. So being able to do something, being good at something. And when you think about that in the context of what we expect of school-age children in school, they have to sit at a desk, listen to the teacher, do what they say, do well in school, do all your work, turn in your assignments on time, make lots of friends, and these are all things that kids with ADHD struggle with. And so when they struggle with that, they feel like they're just not good. And getting all that negative feedback really impacts the way that they feel about themselves.
20,000 more negative comments than their peers by the age of 12.
Yep.
Well, there is a reminder to be positive with children. With everyone. We all need to be positive. There's too much negative out there.
Exactly. We need to be uplifting everyone else.
Yes.
This is just a reminder that ADHD sticks around. And then usually how severe the symptoms predicts whether it'll stick around. In young children, I think, the most common symptoms are hyperactivity and impulsivity. And then older children, most of what you see is inattention. Usually because the hyperactivity is kind of calmed down. It's turned into just fidgeting and wiggling and talking. So.
The ones that are always getting called out in class.
Yes.
To quit talking.
Yep. This is getting into like the really hardcore science stuff, which I think is important to understand, because a lot of people are like, is this a real thing?
I find educators to be really interested in the brain. Yes. So feel free to
Good.
No, they really are interested in neuroanatomy, and anytime we have a conference, those sessions are packed.
Oh, wow.
So
I can nerd out.
Nerd out on this.
Sweet.
Yes.
So there's been a lot of brain scans and research done on ADHD, and this is just like a small sample of the stuff that basically has the most data behind it. But when you compare, children, first of all, like over development, their brain changes drastically. And so there's like thinning of certain areas going on, there's growth in other areas going on. And this is talking mostly about some key parts of the default mode network. So this is the network that kind of controls attention and being able to sustain attention for tasks and that kind of stuff. This is also the part of the brain that plays a role in decision making, executive function, which are impaired in children with ADHD. So when they compared children over the course of development into adulthood who had ADHD and children who didn't, they noticed that the thinning of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, so that's this blue area, kind of on the outside of the brain. Thinning of that and the medial prefrontal cortex, so the inside of the brain, kind of in between the two hemispheres. Thinning of that's associated with the severity and persistence of ADHD symptoms.
Interesting.
So that area being thinner in children with ADHD. And that was sustained over time when you compare them at, 8, 9, 10 years old to 18, 19 years old.
That anatomy stays consistent.
Yep. And the components of these networks, that's part of this default mode network, which is basically, as we've studied the brain, we've kind of come to the realization that it's not like looking at the stomach or, looking at the liver, where you just have this one organ and it does stuff.
Yeah.
And it has a dedicated function. Our brain's a lot more complicated, and connections between these different parts of the brain as a network kind of that plays a huge role in these different disorders and different functions in daily life.
It's amazing that any of us can function with all of the complexities
I
of
know,
the human
right?
body. McKenna, do we have any questions yet? Okay.
So default mode network is active during daydreaming, which you might find a lot of your ADHD kids doing. So they're just strengthening that part of their brain. But it's deactivated whenever they're working on goal-oriented tasks. So, I don't know, completing a math homework sheet. That's switched off. And then any cognitive tasks requiring working memory. So I like to think of working memory as RAM, for anybody that knows a whole lot about computers. RAM is random access memory. It's basically just some memory in your computer where your computer temporarily stores stuff. That doesn't stay there forever, but it's temporarily stored there so that you can get to it quickly with your processor and manipulate it in some way. Working memory is basically the same thing. So it's information that you're manipulating actively. And that's really weak in ADHD.
Yay, more brain.
Yes, more brain. This is the last bit of brain. This is actually the most interesting. So the corpus callosum, this is one of those pathways that connects the two hemispheres and different parts of the brain. So there's lots of, you want to think of it as like internet cables going through there. And they've noticed that, so this part of the brain changes in size as kids get older. But throughout childhood, adolescence, going into young adulthood, in children that have ADHD that's persistent, this part of the brain is smaller. And it's associated with, it's correlated with the presence and severity of ADHD symptoms. What's really interesting is in children whose ADHD resolves as they become adults, this reverts back to normal.
Really?
Yeah.
So it can, over time, it can resolve itself where you don't have clinically ADHD?
Yep.
Well, that's hopeful.
Yeah. We just don't know how to make that happen.
Okay.
Yet. We're working on that. We're working on it.
All right. So this is management from more of a clinical perspective. This picture makes me so sad.
Yeah.
It must be really frustrating for these kids for this to be what they're experiencing.
So I think the important thing for children, I think it's important for parents and the people that are taking care of them to have an understanding of what ADHD is and how it affects them. And also for them to kind of understand themselves how this child's ADHD affects them.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's okay to be frustrated. Like, kids with ADHD can be frustrating sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah.
For all the adults trying to support them,
Yeah.
it can be frustrating.
And it's okay to acknowledge that.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
You know?
Yeah.
It's better to acknowledge that than to inadvertently, like, kind of take it out on the kid.
Mm-hmm.
But some basics that can help are just having structure. Kids with ADHD do great with structure and routine.
Mm.
Because then they kind of know what to expect and they can kind of fall into a rhythm.
Mm-hmm.
So as much as you can do that and support that, I think that's good. Physical activity, I think, it's great for kids with ADHD.
Yeah, I mean, they're all fidgety and...
Exactly. I just moved here from Florida, like in July. So I guess
welcome to snow.
Yes. You know, when I applied to college, I specifically applied to schools south of the Mason-Dixon line.
Oh.
Because I lived in, the southern U.S. for most of my childhood and did not know what snow was.
Well, now you do.
Yep. Yep. I have broken that trend. Actually,
for those of you who are watching this in July, we just had a big snowstorm. Yes. So there
and
you
it
go.
Wasn't that awful.
It's beautiful.
It is. It's gorgeous.
I love the snow.
So anyway, the schools in Florida, for some reason, they decided that PE and recess were like optional.
Oh, wow.
And then I move here and my kids are like, we have 3 recesses. And I'm just like, what? This is fantastic.
Yeah.
So getting these kids outside.
Yeah.
And when they get into like middle school and high school, encouraging them to do sports, I think, is great. It gives them an outlet.
Yeah.
Limiting options, especially with younger kids, the whole, instead of saying, hey, pick something from this huge box of prizes, here are 3 things you can choose from. Which one of these would you like? Kind of making that a routine.
So that can cause that anxiety to have too many options.
Exactly. Because they can't, then it's harder to focus on what they actually want.
Okay.
So this little chart over here is kind of referring to reward systems. So kids with ADHD, their reward networks work a little bit differently. They are really, really reinforced by rewards that are given pretty immediately.
Mm-hmm.
And especially when you compare them to typical kids. So if you give them a prize right away, that is going to be so much more reinforcing for them than a typical kid. Now, if you wait 5 minutes, that prize probably means nothing to them at that point.
That makes sense, because their attention has gone somewhere else.
Exactly. They probably don't know why you're giving them a prize 5 minutes later.
5 minutes.
They're just like, oh, cool, prize, okay.
Okay.
So figuring out ways to reward
Quick
them right
reinforcement.
away. And sometimes that can be, that can just be telling them that they're doing a good job.
Mm-hmm.
Because even those verbal rewards are a lot more reinforcing.
That's important, I think, because I think, we often think of rewards as, here's a piece of candy. The sugar will calm you down. Here's...
Sugar-free piece of candy?
Yeah. No, those are nasty.
Yeah, those are kind of gross.
Only in the case of an emergency. So, and then it is heritable.
Yeah, so if you're having a lot of frustration with, these parents that, can't seem to get their kids' homework done.
Like I said, I've never had a parent be difficult.
We were just talking about what kind of supports parents and caregivers need in order to try to help kids with ADHD and things that they can do to help these kids. And so part of that psychoeducation, which we just spent a lot of time talking about, kind of the understanding what ADHD is and how it affects kids. And then also trying to kind of allay any negative feelings that you may have developed towards kids that are particularly difficult to manage because of the ADHD.
Well, one of the reasons why I wanted to put this webinar together. And as I mentioned, ADHD is one that is coming up a lot. When I was a school counselor, we had a lot of parents saying, my child has ADHD, and there was always this question, do they need a 504 plan? And we'll talk about that. But it can be frustrating because you're getting all of these students and, wanting a 504 plan, all of these parents wanting a 504 plan. And how do you gauge that? Because some of them really are impacted by it and need it, and others are not. And so that's one of the reasons I wanted to put this webinar together. So.
And I think there's many different ways that kids can be impacted by it that affects the classroom. Whether it's their grades, which I think is the most common reason why parents are asking for a 504 plan, is because, oh, my kid's getting like B's, C's, D's. Sometimes they come in and ask for it just because, oh, my doctor just diagnosed my kid with ADHD. They must need this. But there's other ways that it can affect kids, like we talked about earlier. It affects them socially. So, if you notice that it's really affecting their interactions with peers, then maybe it might be appropriate. If it's affecting their interactions with you as a teacher, then it may be appropriate too.
There you go.
Yep. So this is more directed specifically at schools. I talked a little bit on the last slide about outside time, physical activity. Kids with ADHD do great if they have an opportunity to get up and run around. And recess and physical education, that kind of stuff kind of drops off, I think, as kids go into junior high school. And that's where school sports can really come in and replace that and give them, scheduled, hey, this is when you go run around on a basketball court and try to shoot hoops or something to get all that energy out. But that can actually, physical activity doesn't just help with burning off some of that restlessness, it actually does help with concentration and attention.
Does diet impact, well, I mean, we talked about sugar, but can diet really impact their symptoms?
There've been some studies about it, and there's no real conclusive evidence that it affects it. But I think in general, kids should be eating a healthy diet that's going to be good for them all around.
That's true. Humans should be eating healthy.
Now, I say that as I sit here drinking like a 0-calorie Rockstar.
Well, it's 0 calories. So, and as all of us are eating all of our holiday treats.
Yes. Yeah. I still have a green bean casserole in my freezer.
That's healthy. I'm talking about the sugar cookies and the chocolates. Yes.
I'm going to start that baking this weekend.
I think
Speaking of ADHD.
I know. we just never. Proof and point. Okay.
Yep. But in school, 504 plan is important. If a kid needs an IEP, evaluating them for an IEP, especially if there's like learning disorders going on as well, or if they have anxiety or depression that's playing a role too.
And now that you said learning disorders are often associated with that, I think that's something to think about as far as testing a student for special education.
Yeah.
And now, I as far as in 504 law, they don't need to have both. If they have an IEP, they don't need a 504 on top of that, and that's sometimes confusing for people. But so it's, if they have a 504 plan solo or they have IEP, they don't need a 504. So
yeah, just one. Don't make things complicated.
No, it does make things more complicated. Yeah. 2 meetings, lots of paperwork.
Yeah, no. Reward programs for younger kids, especially implemented by teachers. Sometimes like some increased structure by teachers. I've asked teachers for my middle school kids. In middle school, like these kids are now responsible for changing classes, like every period they have to keep track of, all their assignments and a little planner and write things down. And I think the biggest thing that my kids in clinic that had ADHD struggled with their parents, it just drove them crazy, was actually writing down their assignments in their planner. Like they'd come home and there's nothing in their planner.
Yes. I mean, every parent experiences that, and then
Yes.
especially the student who has ADHD. Yeah.
Yep. And so I'd work out with the parents, like through the parents, kind of work out with the teachers. Okay, what can we do to support this kid? Whether it's the teacher writes down what the assignment is in the planner or prints it out and just hands it to the kid.
Mm-hmm.
You know, just something, or even just emailing it to the parent or having it online. I love online stuff for kids with ADHD.
Yeah.
Because then the parents can just go on and be like, oh, yeah, no, you have this due today, and you're supposed to read these chapters. Of course, then they leave the book at school, but,
Yeah.
yeah.
As
At
far as
least
an
have it there.
access issue, I always encourage schools to have multiple ways for our students who don't maybe have internet access or don't have technology
True,
at home
yeah.
that they can access. So multiple ways to get that information. Sometimes that can be an access issue.
Yes.
Oh, assessment.
And then finally, yeah, assessments. So figure out whether these things are working. And again, that requires a lot of communication between teachers and parents and counselors to figure out whether these supports are working. So in clinic, I focus on handing out these little rating scales just because they're easy. I like to do the SNAP 4 when I was in clinic because it's one page and it goes through all the ADHD symptoms and it's just like rate the severity. I don't like giving teachers more work than they already have to do. So it's like, okay, here, one page, that's it, just check boxes. And usually try to get like a snapshot of morning and afternoon, how this kid's doing.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Well, and we have to be careful in schools as far as we don't want to be, you know, in a treatment position or a diagnosis position, and but also we have some schools have school psychologists or can access school psychologists who are able to give some of these assessments that they can utilize. We have to be careful that they don't, with 504, that they don't require an assessment or something or a note from the doctor because that's an access issue. But they can be really helpful source of information when they're developing or you know, assessing if the student is eligible. But but I would imagine even for a teacher, if they had access to something like that for themselves, that they can see, oh, these are the, or a counselor, they can see these are the types of things that we need to be looking for. And they can go through that checklist. So it's not necessarily, I'm diagnosing this child, but I'm seeing, oh, wow, this child is demonstrating all of these things that they in that assessment. So is that something we can access online, that SNAP 4? Or is that a diagnostic tool?
That's a diagnostic
Oh, okay.
tool. Yeah,
Okay.
both of those are.
It seems like there are things online that are
Yeah.
like checklists for.
I think the Vanderbilt's easier to find online. The SNAP, if I've tried searching the SNAP online before, and you usually come up with like there's a longer version of it that asks a ton of questions. And
Yeah.
The SNAP 4 is literally just asking questions about ADHD and ODD.
Well, as long as our educators are not putting themselves in a, you know,
Yeah.
diagnostic position where they're thinking that they can say this child has this, then I think any tool out there that can give them an indication these are things to watch out for, I think would be helpful. But yeah, if they can access a school psychologist, that's something else that they can do.
Yes.
Okay.
And just some things that individuals can do. So actually, and these are things that I think work well with kids even.
They do seem to like meditation.
Yeah.
I imagine it'd be difficult for them, though, to get their mind to calm down at that point.
Yes. Yeah, meditation with kids that have ADHD, I usually lean more towards, like, guided meditation.
Mm-hmm.
So, progressive muscle relaxation with, you know, the soothing voice that's like, tense your bicep, release your bicep. Like
even-
something for them to focus on.
Or yoga, like moving and meditation.
Yep.
Kids do love that.
Yes, they do. I'm surprised at how popular yoga is on our unit.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So you offer yoga and...
Yes. Yes. We force the children to go to yoga, and usually after day 1, and we don't have to force them. They like going to it.
Well, and just as a side note, because I don't want to forget to mention this, but So you do work in a residential treatment.
It's a crisis stabilization unit, so
Okay.
short-term stay.
Okay. And you offer some free assessments or something like that for anyone who walks in. Like what kinds of I don't know if you do ADHD assessments, but just as I want to have I want to have people know you're a resource, especially if
Yeah.
they're school counselors and school psychologists they can send your way.
So for teens and adults that are struggling, so I work at Salt Lake Behavioral Health. It's a freestanding psychiatric hospital. I run the adolescent unit, and our intake department, they will do a free assessment on anyone that's in crisis. You know, if they come in and they can talk to a counselor, and they can basically help them figure out, okay, what kind of services do you need, and hook this person up with services, whether it's admitting them to the hospital or, hey, maybe we need to see if we can hook you up with some outpatient care.
So that can really help our families with
Yes.
a limited income that it's a free service. So I just want to make sure everybody knows about that. We all want to support our students and families, and it's helpful for us to know what resources are out there. So that's how I met. I met Nina at a conference and we got talking, and so it's really helpful to
Yeah.
know other resources. So anyway, so there's a little side note there. So
Yep.
go ahead.
Oh yeah, and then behavioral therapy, so teaching these kids organizational skills, social skills, and then treating anything that's going along with what's happening with the ADHD. So when I was in clinic treating kids, I really like to use CBT for kids that have ADHD to treat their anxiety and depression, because a lot of the issues were these lessons they had learned about themselves and kind of ingrained, these automatic negative thoughts. It's the term that we like to use.
And so for those who
Yeah.
don't know what CBT, that's
Oh, sorry.
cognitive behavioral therapy?
Yes.
Right? Okay.
Yep, cognitive behavioral therapy. So addressing the behaviors and kind of the thoughts that contribute to these feelings of anxiety and depression. And it's also like pretty bite size. Yeah. For a kid that has issues with attention, I think it's a pretty good therapy.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about 504. So I always like to talk about child find because this is a legal requirement that a lot of educators aren't aware of. I certainly was not aware of that as an educator for 10 years. I'll be totally honest about that because this is why I was a school counselor for a decade, and I did not know about child find. Now I feel like, well, let me just read the definition. It's included in the Individual Students with Disabilities Act, so the special education programs, and Section 504, that requires all educators to identify, locate, and evaluate all children who have disabilities and who may be entitled to special education and 504 services. Now, as a school counselor, that was something that was natural for us to look out for kids who might need more supports. But still, I did not know that law, so I want to make sure everybody knows what it is because it is a legal requirement. So, and Section 504, a lot of people don't know it's a civil rights law. It is under the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So originally it was more narrow and restrictive, and then in 2009 the ADA Amendments Act broadened the interpretation, and then students with disabilities in school settings fall under the civil rights protection of Section 504. And the law and regulations prohibit discrimination on the basis of disability in all school programs and activities in public schools receiving direct or indirect funding. So some of the indirect funding often goes to private schools. And so sometimes sometimes 504 will apply to private schools, other times not. So it's designed to provide equal access and fairness in general education to students with disabilities through their 504 accommodation plan. Now, as far as eligibility goes, for 504, a person with a disability is one who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. Substantially limits is not defined under the law. That is something that is decided by a team by looking at multiple sources of data on students. So this is something that is not very clear often as far as what is substantially limiting their access to free appropriate public education. Also, if they have a record of such an impairment or is regarded as having such an impairment. So because they don't need a diagnosis. So a student is eligible for a Section 504 accommodation plan if an evaluation shows, and that's the team that we're talking about, that the student has a mental or physical impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities or major bodily functions, and it impacts the student's education. So here is a list of, not an exhaustive list of major life activities, and I highlighted the activities that I think might be the most impacted. I didn't highlight learning, but concentrating thinking, and the more I hear you talking about the things that you see in your clinical practice, I think there are more here. Like you said, sleeping. What else did you say? So learning, writing, communicating. So
interacting with others.
It can impact a lot of major life activities. Maybe not as many major bodily functions.
As far as we know yet.
As far as we know yet. The science continues always.
Yes.
So, as far as Office for Civil Rights, so that's what OCR is, I didn't really know that as an educator either. I'm just going to own up to the fact that I am a lifelong learner in education, and so I've started to understand more about Office for Civil Rights and their relationship with education, and so some of the guidance that they have provided about students with ADHD. Often students who are academically doing very well, they're assumed not to be impacted.
Yes,
and
those are the
so,
ones that are easy to miss.
Yeah, so they have straight A's, but there's reasons behind that. What you're explaining is that comorbidity with anxiety, and and they're trying to have this structure, so it can impact their sleeping. And these are all major life activities that can be substantially impacted. So we need to. There is a case law and OCR findings where that is what the school focused on, and that didn't turn out so well for them when there was an investigation. So OCR presumes eligibility with an ADHD diagnosis. So when we're evaluating a student, so if there is an ADHD diagnosis, as far as where OCR, their stance on it, most likely you should do an evaluation. Because they presume eligibility with a diagnosis. So if a parent comes to you and says, the physician has said, my child has ADHD, you should probably do an evaluation. Doesn't mean that says you give the student a 504 plan, but it's one of the sources of information. And then medical assessment is not required, which we just said. And a parent cannot be charged. So I always like to provide an analogy as far as why we can't require a diagnosis, because it's an access issue, and students can't be discriminated against. If we have a student who both say they have ADHD, not necessarily a diagnosis or whatever, but let's say both parents are coming to you and they have ADHD, and this student has health insurance, has access to get the diagnosis, the other student does not have access. Maybe they don't even have a card to get to the doctor. Then it's discrimination because this student is going to get services and this other student is not. So that's why you can't require diagnosis. So it looks like we have a question.
Who was doing the ADHD diagnosing?
Well, only, I would say, a physician who can, or any sort of trained clinical person for...
Yeah, trained clinical provider.
So. And I would think a school psychologist could, I don't know that they could diagnose. They can diagnose.
Yeah.
So someone who's licensed to diagnose ADHD.
Yes.
To diagnose that type of any type of impairment. So that's another reason. If you want to require diagnosis, that's fine as long as you pay for it. So you have to arrange it. Even if it's not necessarily something that you have to pay for if you have another person that can provide it. So maybe you have a school psychologist available that can provide that, but you cannot require them to go to a physician and pay for that diagnosis. And when I'm saying RTI, MTSS, response to intervention, multi-tiered system of support, or positive behavioral intervention. Oh man, I'm trying to remember all acronyms in education.
Positive behavioral intervention system? I'm making stuff up here.
Supports right now. Okay, can't remember. So these cannot be used as a prerequisite. The reason I bring these up is because there's a lot of times that parents will come in and say, I want an evaluation for 504, and they'll say, well, we need to do these 3 weeks of interventions before we can do that. And so that's not appropriate, and it sounds like we have a question here in a second.
Is the evaluation academic or is it clinical?
As far as ADHD, well, ADHD involves more than academics, so I'd imagine a diagnosis of...
So an evaluation for clinical diagnosis would be clinical.
Yeah.
But are they asking about the 504 evaluation?
I don't know.
Okay. What would a 504 evaluation would be academic, right?
Well, it's the diagnosis terminology that I'm wondering about. So if we're talking about 504 eligibility, a diagnosis can be used in that determination, but it's only one source of data, and a diagnosis itself cannot be required. A diagnosis would involve more than academics. So if we're looking at academics, if we're looking at their grades, how they're performing in class, that sort of thing, that's a source of evidence, but that would not be a diagnosis. So I don't know if that's clarifying the question.
She said yes, and then someone else said, do we assume they have ADD if they say so without diagnosis, or do we do the same RTI observations to see if they see ADD symptoms?
Okay, so when it comes to 504, we shouldn't assume a diagnosis if we haven't been given a diagnosis. So when I say what OCR presumes eligibility with an ADHD diagnosis, that is a diagnosis. So if they have received that diagnosis, OCR presumes eligibility, which doesn't mean the student is eligible, because it's a team decision that has to determine if that ADHD, which has been diagnosed, is substantially impacting one or more major life activities. And it's just one source of information. Now, because I'm sure you can validate this, that a diagnosis of ADHD doesn't necessarily imply the impact. Yes. So you might have a spectrum of students who are diagnosed with ADHD who have a high level of impact and have low, but they have the same diagnosis.
Yep.
So just that alone will not tell you how that student's education is being impacted. So it's just one source of information that you can have but don't require, because you can look at all sorts of other things. Teachers' observations, parents' observations at home, grades, discipline. So if you're just coming on board, we talked a little bit about discipline earlier, that you need to watch out for some of those behavioral issues because conduct disorder and oppositional defiance disorder are often correlated with students with ADHD. There might have been a second part to that question. It was a...
someone asked, you stated that if a parent says they have ADHD, we evaluate. What evaluation is that?
Okay, so, and there was something I remembered about the last question. Response to intervention as far as doing that earlier on. Okay, so let me cover that first. So let's say that you have a student who is exhibiting some symptoms. You're kind of you've got your eye out on this student, you can try some interventions first. It doesn't mean you have to jump right into evaluation. This is something that maybe a teacher, a counselor, that they're noticing some things, and so they think, okay, so we're seeing some symptoms, let's try these interventions, and then and that's fine if that they take some time to do that before initiating an evaluation. Now, if you're seeing like this is pretty severe, then you probably should say, no, I think we need to do a 504 evaluation. But when I say that you can't tell, if you receive a diagnosis, it's not recommended to tell a parent that we need to do these interventions first. So with OCR guidance, there have been a lot of cases where this wait and see has not worked out well. But you can do that while you're doing the evaluation. You have 45 days. So during those 45 days of the evaluation, once you start it, you can do interventions because that will inform you. That will be a source of evidence for you when you're determining eligibility. Okay, and then the last question was?
If the parent says a student has ADHD.
Okay, so if a parent says a student has ADHD, that's a conversation to have where you can say, okay, so what are you seeing? And how severe is it? And that's not a diagnosis. A parent saying, my child has ADHD, that's not a diagnosis. Now you can say, okay, so where are you coming from? So why are you saying that? And if they say, well, a doctor said, then you don't say, okay, well, I need to know from that doctor. You say, oh, okay, because that's a source of information. Like this parent has actually gone to have someone evaluate their child because they are determining that it is impacting their child severely enough to go and get this. And so that's just a piece of information. So when a parent gives you that, you can go through the options and say, okay, so we can try some interventions, and then let's say often the conversation will go, well, no, I want my child on a 504 plan. Okay, so we'll need to get your consent to evaluate. We need to put a team together of people who are knowledgeable of your child, and we'll look at all of this. So we'll look at all the information you've given us. We're gonna find out what other teachers are saying and seeing. We're gonna look at all of this information. Then we can make a decision if that's something that will help your child access their education. Their general education. That's the difference between special education and 504, is access to general education without the specialized instruction. So does that cover that?
I think so. We have another question.
Okay.
If the student receives IDEA evaluation and position evaluation, they state no impairment, can they still qualify?
Okay, so this is if a student does not qualify under IDEA.
I guess so.
So they get
I think
the
that's what they're saying.
evaluation and
position evaluation, and they both state no impairment, can they still qualify?
yes, absolutely. In fact, when I talk about looking about child find and trying to identify students who might need special education or 504 services, often that's one of the things that you look for is, did they not qualify for an IEP? It doesn't mean that if they didn't qualify for an IEP that they automatically qualify for a 504, but they definitely could, because you just have to look at that educational impact. Is it substantially limiting one or more of those major life activities? And there are a lot. You can't just look at academics. So it's possible that they could. So they look at different things when it comes to qualifying for special education, because that's something that requires some sort of specialized instruction and modifications within the classroom. And please feel free to ask questions. So a lot of times with ADHD, especially our parents want everything but the kitchen sink in the plan. So, and I think we need to make sure that we only include the non-negotiables. Otherwise, it can be unmanageable. And sometimes over-servicing a child is
Yeah.
has negative consequences. We want them to be able to adapt to their environment and learn how to live with their different impairments. But so if we think that just throwing all of this at them, that could cause some implementation problems, because everything in the 504 plan has to be followed with fidelity. And so, and it can impact the learning in the class too, if the teacher is so overburdened with these things. But, you know, often the things for students who have been identified as experiencing ADHD symptoms and are impacted by these symptoms can benefit the whole class. So when we're talking about an organized environment, when we're talking about chunking things, when we're talking about all of these things, they can be beneficial to the whole class. But if it's too overwhelming and we're over accommodating, then that can be really very burdensome. And I think it's a really important point that if an accommodation is ignored, that accommodation might impact that student's access to education. So OCR addressed several beliefs that can lead to implementation failures, thinking that those might be optional, that they're unnecessary because the student is academically gifted, and that the student needs to specifically request accommodations on an as-needed basis. That is something really key. A lot of the times they will put the responsibility in the lap of the student to say, I need this. But especially when we're thinking about a student with ADHD, they're not going to think to come and talk to you. They don't even know they don't have the cognitive, like you said, even just in the brain function.
They might be like, oh, I need help with this. And then 10 seconds later, they're thinking about lunch.
Yeah. The teacher says, what did you need help with? I don't remember.
Yes.
I don't know. We've moved on. So here are some sample accommodations that could be used. So extended time, preferential seating, so maybe sitting in the front where they don't have distractions all around them, other kids talking. I think I've seen teachers allow a student to go stand in the back of the classroom, or so they are not sitting there fidgety. The task list, so they know we should be doing. Fidget tools, and chewing gum. This was on our special education
chewing gum drives me
Connections website. This is where I pulled this, and so I questioned those too a little bit. I know that we've had those fidget spinners, especially was a thing for a while, where everybody was going nuts.
Those got banned in schools when I was.
So we have to be careful with these. And if chewing gum or eating candy is against the school rules, just like I said, this is off of Special Ed Connections, but those two, and then the reward penalty.
But on that note, it may not be such a great idea to give a kid chewing gum, but something to put on the top of their pencil that they can chew on can be helpful.
That makes sense.
Like one of those little silicone things. There are silicone bracelets. I know this because I used them a lot with my kids while they were teething.
Silicone bracelets. Oh yeah, I remember those.
Yeah.
When I had babies.
But just give them something to chew on.
That probably wouldn't go too well, those little teething rings at school. But
no.
There are other
social problems. Yeah. But
I use it at work, but people know that I need them. Right, McKenna? My teething ring? Okay, so daily report cards, so they can kind of stay on top of things. Ongoing support on study skills, direct instruction on organizational skills. And see, these are all things that can help the whole class. Helping kids understand study skills and organization. That's something I tried to do as a school counselor. I'd get a backpack and I would put, organize it and have, teach kids. I'd go into classrooms and say, okay, here's how to be organized. So that benefits everybody. Now, so here's a lot of, now remember, we only want to include non-negotiables. And I always say when we're developing a 504 plan, please don't give the parent this list. I've got 2 slides, so don't give them this whole list and ask them what they think would benefit their child, because they're going to say, oh, every single one of these. So don't do that. And you need to base it on the individual needs of the child. So one student might not need a timer to help with focus.
Yeah.
That might not be the what would help this student impact. It's all individualized. And so all of these I pulled off of our administrative educator handbook on Section 504 that is on our website, and I'll provide the link at the end, but it's on my equity page in the 504 tab under resources. So these are just some ideas of some things, and we've talked about some of these things previously. I'm assuming I shouldn't read every single one to people.
Yes, a lot.
It's a long list.
That is a lot.
Okay, so yes, there are a lot of ways to help these kids.
Mm-hmm.
So there you go.
I like that one. What did I tell them?
Okay, so here is what I was talking about with the resources. So that top, and then I'll send out the PowerPoint. I think that will be helpful, especially for those who only got to catch us halfway through. So we do have a couple of upcoming trainings. Oh, I mentioned Special Ed Connection. So that is a great resource for anything that you need help with 504 and IDEA. And you should all have a password. You can get that from your special education director if you don't have it. That is a free resource that the state provides to all educators. So that is the source where I get most of my information. The upcoming webinars, we have diabetes will be the topic, and then discipline of students with disabilities. And that will be the end of the series. Unless you are really thinking there is one that needs to be addressed, I will be happy to do another one, but I think that will be the end of the series. So here are some other resources. And I had a really fun video by Jerry Brooks, if those of you who know our famous Jerry Brooks, on ADHD. Go on YouTube, you've got to watch it. He says that he had ADHD, and he talks about, a student looking up at the teacher's nose, and one shaped like an ostrich egg and the other one shaped, I don't know. Anyway, but his main thing is just that we need to support those kids and love those kids. And then here are some citations from the research that you provided with the things that you said. And then here's our contact information. I don't know if you want to include a phone number, but I figured they could email you if they have any questions.
Email's a good way to get a hold
Well,
of me.
typically for me, email is the best way to get a hold of me too, because I'm out doing webinars and things.
Okay.
So let me open it up to any other questions that they might have while we have an expert in ADHD sitting right here next to me.
Someone asked if the slides will be available.
Yes, I will provide all of the slides and the correct link, and we probably will do some editing. If you missed out on the whole conversation in the middle about being, having the wrong link, I'm sorry, but that's going to be edited out. Okay, well, I'm so glad everyone could join us. Thank you so much. This has been really great for me too. I have learned so much. And feel free to email me if you have any additional questions. And thank you so much.